Hi, I'm Ikea, and for today's video, I want to have an in-depth look into some tools that I've made for Division 1, as I quite enjoy playing some Division 1 here and there, especially since the return of the global events. That's also why this video is going up the time that it is, as after the weekend that this video goes on, there'll be a global event as well in Division 1, so I'll be jumping into that again. And the tools that I've made and the ones that I want to showcase today are specifically a DPS table, as I was kind of missing having this in Division 1, as I'm very used to my own DPS tables, of course, to just kind of try to see through the haze of the weapons and such and what it actually means. So I have made in the same style of Division 2 that I have a Division 1 version. And then as well, a different tool that I always kind of need to have, which is my MultiCalculators, just to compare builds, because of course, yeah, we can calculate out the DPSs and such for the builds. And trying to just, do two of them in different calculators and such. I much prefer to do it like this, where we can just put them all together into one, compare up to 10 builds. And yeah, we'll explain both. Also, I'll show how the MultiCalculator works, and also for the people that are just, per se, maybe not interested in Division 1. The calculator works in the same way effectively in Division 2, so if you've ever wondered how those calculators got filled in, although there is a dedicated video for that, but if you just want to see it in action, we'll show one off. And here's one that I also made earlier, and we'll actually go through that as well, as I had some of the most basic questions. Let's answer some of those as well. For instance, how much does Firearms mean? And also, do those DTE mods, those purple DTE mods, actually make sense? The answer is yes already, but how much sense do they make? So yeah, let's go get started. And first of all, to kind of show where they ended up, of course, for others that want to see them. Of course, I'll link down below to them in the description, as always, but actually the burst and sustain tables will from now on live in the same burst and sustain tables folder that currently the Division 2 ones exist in. It's going to be this final file always, so in this case this 9.0 Division 1 burst and sustain tables. That'll lead to here, and of course, as in the same way as with the Division 2 version, there are tabs at the bottom, which I'm kind of covering up there, but you can see the different tabs down there. As always with spreadsheets, they're at the bottom. Just to be awkward, they put them at the bottom. So yeah, we have them for all the weapon categories, and they're all filled in, and also especially for the MMRs, we're kind of going in the same style of Division 2, as kind of concerning ourselves a little bit more with the base. Then as well, the damage calculator also lives in the same folder as the other damage calculators do, the weapon talents one and the multi-calcs that I have already. That one is now as well at the end of there. It's specifically titled Division 1 DPS multi-calculator. And that'll, of course, go to this one main file. For the multi-calculator, of course, you have to copy it to your own Google Drive if you want to edit into it, because yeah, you can't edit it here, but yeah, you can just hit File and then make a copy. This will take you through an UI to make a copy into your own Google Drive. Once it is there, you can start inputting into it and getting results out of it. Let's go first look at the DPS tables. And for those DPS tables, in the main file here, actually, if you scroll down, you might see a thing that may seem familiar to some people that were playing Division 1 when it was active. Although as well, actually, in Division 2, we have similar looking ones. And that's also where actually I've gotten most of my numbers from, as yeah, we haven't done any back calculating or such as I've done for the burst and sustain tables in Division 2. I've taken wholesale the information from this spreadsheet, as I'll link that one in the spreadsheet or in the description here below to this spreadsheet. And they very kindly have, as this is the old gear attribute sheet, and they have all of the weapon damage ranges as is here actually, all together here. I have kept them actually at the bottom here, although I've cut out basically all of the parts that I didn't care about, because I basically am just gonna concern myself with fully optimized weapons, basically the same way that we kind of would do in Division 2. Just we're gonna kind of assume that everything's optimized to max, and we have the 15% weapon damage on the weapon and such. We don't have, of course, altering bases anymore in Division 2, but we used to actually have that. Now it's basically that weapon damage stat on the thing. But yeah, we're just taking the highest number, as we have in different ranges, for instance, here. As well, for instance, the bonus parts and such, I've cut those out just because we don't care too much about those. They're the same for all the weapon types. But yeah, a big thanks goes out to all the people that have made this in the past, in the long times ago, as yeah, it did. It is, you know, I could have done it without them, but it would have been so much harder. So they definitely deserve a lot of credit here. And then actually, if we kind of look at it here, you'll notice at points that kind of in the same way as on the build ones, we have a green arrow, and that is because in some of the parts, as we'll zoom in here a little, that green arrow actually means that that's where we're setting again our 100% point for comparison's sake, kind of as with the weapon ones as well. And the reason for that is, for instance, in here we have the fall, and while the falls in Division 1 are burst fire, because of that, they actually, well, while they have a bit higher burst and sustain, that in reality that doesn't end up working that way, because unless you're macroing it or are very proficient at exactly clicking. Here, for this one, we're just holding down the button and getting at this DPS. Here, we would need to be perfect on our RPM to get that DPS, which, of course, is less realistic at the very least. So we're kind of taking the 100% point to be basically, yeah, a non-burst weapon. This will come up again as well for SMGs and such. And in there as well, it's kind of in the same way as with Division 2, where we are doing first sustain, then burst, and then also a damage per mag. In doing it that way, yeah, we have 3 different tables, basically. One thing I thought actually mattered for Division 1, and this actually did matter originally for Division 1's weapons and such, is that the Division 1 system actually works with there's a base number, there's a modifier to that base number, and that modifier is actually a modifier to the firearm stat. As it turns out, at some point, they basically normalized this to where actually the combination of the base and this firearm mods always leads to a number that is actually out here. This is 8003, and then a few decimal points after that, which do actually differ, but overall close enough for government work, basically, for it. And by that way, what it means is actually that it doesn't matter how much firearms you have, as some weapons actually in the past, before they kind of normalize the system in this way, would mean that if the firearm modifier is higher, some weapons would prefer to be, for instance, on lower firearms than others. That is no longer the case, but I was under that assumption when I first made this, that still was the case in some ways, and that's also why we have a firearms number here. That does mean that, for instance, here we are specifically already taking something that would be normally from a build. So in the Division 2 ones, we're just, it's the weapon by itself. It's just the base times the RPM of it. Here we're already also including a firearms number. I kind of kept it in the end this way and didn't reduce it out because we could just hide basically this 9,000. But also I wanted all of the numbers in general, always to kind of be visible, and that it's not just a hidden number behind the scenes, because that's already this modifier here, and that can already get a little silly. But basically that means that this burst DPS would be the thing for a firearms build, but then of course here in this case without any other stats, no crits on it, no headshots or anything like that. But yeah, it is, and we can actually alter this number if we wanted to, for instance, see what it is at 3,000. But it turns out that while the number here, of course, changes, the burst and sustain and the mag damage, the numbers change, the percentage difference between them, because they've been kind of normalized, let's say, in this way where the firearm mod doesn't matter, the percentages difference between them stays the same. So it doesn't per se matter anymore to kind of alter that, at least not for comparison's sake. Yeah, let's go and actually get started here and actually look through each weapon type and kind of, yeah, do a little bit of analysis. And starting with the ARs, usually the most popular weapon type anyway in most divisions and in Division 1 as well. And yeah, it should be no surprise that, well, yeah, we have the fall actually above the M4/LVOAC. That's the LVOAC actually, and M4. That's where we're kind of putting our 100% mark, because the fall, again, they are burst weapons here, not burst DPS, but burst fire weapons. So we're kind of excluding them a little, but they should definitely be maybe considered, because they are actually pretty high on burst. They are the top sustainer as well up there already. But yeah, as we kind of already know, the M4 and the LVOC are definitely some of the top picks. What I didn't know actually is that it's a pretty big gap to all of the other ones, much more so, especially in the burst numbers here, than, for instance, we would have in Division 2, like the second place in Division 2 being, in general, the FAMAS, or from the FAMAS to, or well, the Lexington to the FAMAS, but then the FAMAS to the fall, let's say. That's not that big of a gap. Here already, we're dropping quite a bit going to second place. Yeah, I can see the popularity here quite well. But then actually, so on the G36 at least, it's kind of can be seen as maybe the second place competitive one, where it does actually out-sustain it. Part of that is down to its much faster reload, if I remember correctly, yes. And that does mean that, yeah, they are actually pretty, that could be competitive. But I feel actually everything else really isn't, and we kind of know that already, right? We usually go with M4s. One of the things as well here, again, I'm separating out the exotics just because they still have, at least for most of them, they're still they're tied to a specific talent. That isn't the case, for instance, for the Liberator and such, but for instance, yeah, the Urban MDR is kind of tied to a specific talent. So we're kind of separating them out. Here's well, the Urban MDR would be pretty high in these numbers, and actually way higher than, for instance, if we kind of just look at this burst here, it is way higher than the M4, but then kind of just behind the fall. So it would kind of slot in just behind the fall here. One that I actually like using quite a lot in Division 1 is the Bullfrog. And the Bullfrog, of course, has that its own talent, where if we don't put any accuracy or stability mods on it, we get a 15% damage bonus, which, yeah, no other talent can kind of come close to that. And that's actually what makes it competitive. But then its handling is much worse than the M4. So there is still, for me, basically, in the AR category, it's the Bullfrog very much there. The M4 is there. I do want to actually try to get a decent G36 and kind of mess around with that, as yeah, that faster reload I could definitely see being a little bit useful. But basically, it's gonna be more the like going from a FAMAS to a CTAR in Division 2. But the rest is definitely not competitive enough, because yeah, once we start dropping behind that, because for instance the ACR here, where for instance in Division 1 some of the lower bursters are a little bit higher on their sustain, in this case the ACR actually also isn't that. So a lot of the other weapons kind of in this category kind of fall off for me. Of course, the Urban MDR can do its own thing, being a burst or a single or semi-auto fire. So we can use it with Sentry Skull. So that is like, that's its purpose anyway. That's where most people will make use of it. So that one has a place, but I feel basically, yeah, it's the M4 and the Bullfrog, and then the G36 you could mess around with. And I definitely want to find a good G36 and mess around with it a little bit more. But the differences especially are going to some of the others, especially dropping down to the Mark 16, for instance, here, where it's pretty bad on burst. It is also behind the rest on sustain. They weren't as good at balancing in Division 1, and they left the balance here a little unbalanced. And on their damage per mag, that is the only place where, for instance, yeah, the AKM can kind of shine, and of course as well some of the slower firers. And that's also kind of the reason actually that I want to try the G36. Its damage per mag is a little bit higher, but also here it is just a little bit, because the jump from especially the AK to the SCAR is pretty hefty, and then to the G36, but then the rest is kind of packed together here from the G36 to the M4. So yeah, basically, in that sense, the choice for the M4 is definitely well founded. Same for the Bullfrog, and that was already the case before we even had these. I kind of gravitated towards those. Let's go to the SMGs, and here going into the SMGs, a bigger category here again, some of the exotics as well. And here actually the standout especially becomes the house. The house as well, having a decent talent as that third talent. It is substantially higher than most of the other weapons here again as well. We're kind of excluding this MP5 burst. Although I do want to try with the MP5 burst and just run and see if I can kind of keep it at its RPM. But honestly, even if you're kind of messing up the RPM a little bit, this is going to drop. This is always going to drop because you're never going to be able to do it the way that an automatic weapon can, unless you're macroing, basically, which I wouldn't recommend. That kind of macroing would definitely be beyond the terms of service, basically. So here then we see that actually, if we kind of take the MP7 as the second spot here, and the one that we've had have as our 100%, it is definitely 20k-ish behind in the burst DPS here at this 9k firearms, behind the house. And the house having a decent enough talent, yeah, I can see why this is the one that everybody always goes for. Because in my case, actually, I was trying to, I played around with basically all of the SMGs a little bit. I went like, is it true that like only the house matters? Yeah, it turns out the house always wins. Because also, if we kind of take it to sustain, that's always the thing as well. Of course, we want to have a weapon, preferably we pick on burst first, and then preferably the sustain, and the damage per mag isn't horrible. Here, the house is also one of the top contenders when it comes to sustain, because actually, if we kind of compare it to the high ends, again, that MP5 burst, that one is a little bit higher than it. But it would be basically, if it's slotted up in here, it will be in the second spot and 20k ahead of the second place, which is this PP19. That's kind of the old FAMAS in Division 2 in the category, basically, where it is just the best burster, one of the best sustainers, and because of that, it is the all-round go-to. And of course, yeah, its talent in this case as well is actually pretty good. It is decent enough to be used. And it averages out basically to 10%, which could be, on a different weapon, could be maybe responsive or something. But yeah, here you're averaging out to that 10% anyway. And then on the damage per mag, it is also not too bad. While it is a little bit lower, which is often to be expected from burst weapons. Also, of course, strikers being very popular, this is one of the higher RPM SMGs, is actually the vectors and such, which I had totally not paid attention to in Division 1, that, they're actually not at the 1200s that we see in Division 2. One of the things as well, if you weren't aware of it, a lot of weapons actually existed in Division 1. Well, basically all of the starter weapons of Division 2 were already weapons in Division 1. Some of them as well from some of the exotics in Division 1 kind of became normal weapons. So for instance, here the Tommy gun and the Thompson. This is becoming the Thompson becoming the M1928. But yeah, those are basically in here. And then even some of the weapons types, because rifles did not exist in Division 1. So for instance, here we have one of those where the USC here is actually an SMG, but then in Division 2 it becomes an rifle. Same for instance as well, actually, for the LVOAC and the lightweight M4 that we were seeing a minute ago. The police M4 stayed in the AR category, but the lightweight M4 and the LVOAC became rifles. That's actually what the rifle, the whole rifle class type is made out of, is basically mostly MMRs. There's a ton of MMRs that are MMRs in Division 1 because, yeah, rifles didn't exist. They went to there, and then one SMG, several ARs and such went into that category as well. In the SMG category, yeah, definitely the very much the standard is the house, and it's kind of excluding everything else for use. So yeah, I've been kind of running the house myself, even though I've kind of been trying to experiment with the others. Yeah, they just, especially seeing it now in a flat number here. Yeah, I can see the recommendation. And as we come to LMGs here. This category is much smaller than in Division 2. A lot of additions to it came in the form in Division 2 to it. But we do have some of the classics. We do have the MG5, the L86, the RPK, the MT49, and the M60 in the high ends. And yeah, Big Alejandro and Pagan and Hungry Hog. And yeah, Pagan we're kind of seeing again in Division 2 with, although in Division 1 already it really didn't have a place. I feel in Division 2 even less so with Bullet King there. But before we ramble on way too much about Division 2, what about Division 1? So here we definitely see that the Big Alejandro, especially, while also, of course, it is tied to a specific talent. Its burst is much higher than basically anything else. That's kind of why we go with it. But I would definitely say that, for instance, the Big Alejandro's talent, I quite actually enjoy just having the consistency of MG5. That's actually my go-to for Lone Star builds. I generally go with the MG5s, and then just the third talent can also be something, for instance, like Predatory, which can give us some healing and kind of give us some sustaining. Where, of course, with the Big Alejandro, you're kind of stuck into its talent, although its talent does, of course, line up well. Very well with whenever Lone Star actually triggers correctly, and you kind of, well, not triggers, it's a chance-based trigger. So when you get it going several times with the Big Alejandro, this burst DPS is definitely very much up there. Of note as well, actually, I didn't talk about this, but as the same as with the Division 2 tables, I've taken to here with the magazine size, always kind of putting a magazine, as long as the weapon has a magazine slot, to put in basically a mod that effectively putting in a mod that affects its magazine size. And that's just because that's just actually how we end up running them, right? I'm not going to leave that magazine slot empty. So looking at the damage per mag without those numbers, actually, to me, doesn't make much sense. And because of the way that it's percentage based in Division 1, that means that it isn't, for instance, a plus 50 mag. It is a plus 120%, 121% mag, depending on how high we go. In here, actually, I've taken to, I believe, everything is 120%, even though that's not the highest number we can go with. There is definitely 121% mods, but just, I thought that would be a clean number here. Also, to not have any decimal points, of course, and such. Although actually with 121 we wouldn't still either see that. But yeah, overall the Big Alejandro, definitely one of the standouts. The MG5 is definitely here one of the standouts. Now, of course, this isn't like the MG5 that we have in Division 2 nowadays with its super fast reload. This is, 8 years ago at best, last balanced. But it's definitely for things like Lone Star. We kind of, those two stand out to me. Things like the L86 and the RPK, just while doing decent on burst, here we kind of see this again, where they even the very, well, actually no. So starting with year 2, basically, especially the gear 2.0 rebalances, all of the weapons are in Division 2 were kind of pretty close to each other. They were kind of in a band of around like 13-15%, depending on weapon type and such. Here we already see that, for instance, going from the first spot to the second spot, that's a 10% difference in the burst. And they don't make up for that much in their sustain. Now here in the MG5, of course, the reload is actually a really impactful factor for its sustain, but it still actually isn't that far behind some of the other places. And then as well, if we're running it with Lone Star, we're kind of trying to get rid of this, right? So that's less impactful. And then in the damage per mag sense, it should be no surprise. Some of the slower firings, higher damage per shot weapons here as well with 220 rounds. That's gonna take the top spot. The M249s definitely as well have a place. I quite often end up using them if I'm just running it on, let's say, a striker or something, because actually I like them as secondary weapons. You can also just have them together with the reload talent that I'm totally remembering the name of, and I'm not sneaking into the game real quick to kind of have a look at Meticulous, where you can kind of have an on-kill chance, basically a salvage in Division 2 terms, where you have an on-kill chance to reload the entire magazine in one go. And that actually works out fine for, just running it without Lone Star, even, because you'll likely get a few kills and then maybe get a reload, and otherwise you'll just have to deal with that reload. The LMGs, definitely the standouts, MG5, Big Alejandro, we kind of knew that. Some of the other ones, especially, for instance, Hungry Hog, which sometimes gets recommended, I'm not seeing it. While it is actually a decent talent as well, it isn't, especially its talent isn't as, I feel, usable as just either the Big Alejandro or just having something like Ferocious even there. Let's go on to the next one. which is shotguns, as we come to the other one that we could use on a Lone Star as well here. Here, we're also, again, actually, I'm kind of excluding the double barrel in the 100% mark here in the same way as with Division 2. The double barrels are way high up in there, but as of course, they have, as the name implies, 2 barrels, 2 shots, and then you have a, well, at least in Division 1, not that long of a reload, especially, for instance, well, on the Cassidy and on this one, on the double barrel, neither of those is actually that long of a reload, not as long as like we have nowadays in Division 2. But yeah, they do horrendous. Well, actually, they're not that horrendous on the sustain, just because that reload is a little bit better here. But I feel the double barrel is, yeah, it ends up not being that usable. But then also, actually, what we kind of see is that the Showstopper, especially, has a really decent burst and also a decent sustain in comparison to a lot of the other ones here. Because that's then usually kind of as the same way as the house is in the SMG category. I feel that's how the Showstopper gets kind of treated in Division 1 terms. And that kind of does hold true. Now, of course, as well, the Showstopper in the same fashion as in Division 2, we can stack with the ACS. You can do that. Same stacking is also per pellet in Division 1. And because of that, the Showstopper kind of fits in perfectly for that. Although I've here and there kind of used an SASG 12, but it's a much slower firing, of course, than the 240 of the Showstopper. Of note, actually, yeah, the 240 here instead of the 300 that we have in Division 2. That does actually make a little bit of a difference. It's not that humongous more of a difference, but this also just being auto means that you just hold down the button and it just goes. There isn't actually other good standouts. I always personally do like the Medved, but actually seeing it in its burst and sustain numbers here, I can kind of see why, while I like the big hit, I'd much rather just at that point kind of be on like Hunter's Fate, maybe with a marksman rifle, with a bolt action marksman rifle, because you can kind of, yeah, you get that there, and then without actually, you know, having horrendous burst. While kind of fun, yeah, I can definitely see here now that, yeah, it did feel weak. It is weak, especially if we're kind of, yeah, looking at it in burst numbers. Most of the other shotguns actually kind of pale in comparison quickly to the when it comes to the Showstopper. That doesn't mean that they're not usable, but I would definitely say, for instance, the M870 is not balanced with the rest, really, because on both burst and sustain, it just does not keep up. Super 90 in the SASG can kind of be used. The double barrel can sometimes be fun just to stick in someone and just pull two, quickly put 2 shots in them. But then you're still always stuck with this somewhat slower reload. On the damage burn mag as well, just because the Showstopper can be so much longer before it has to hit that reload. This is also a big factor, especially for especially a stacking striker, the same way that we kind of do in Division 2. The Showstopper is definitely the standout here, and kind of like the house is kind of keeping this whole category in its wraps. And going on to the pistols, one of the things I feel in this category that gets recommended quite a bit is especially the X45s, which is actually the one that I was kind of leaning towards. But then I kind of realized that these RPMs, especially on pistols, is not really attainable consistently. Especially, for instance, I do like running a sentry skull that is made around a pistol, because that works as well, with a bulwark shield, so you can kind of have tankiness and kind of supportiness, but not that much damage. I was kind of leaning towards the X45s and such, especially as well for the mod slots, because in here as well, there's a bunch of pistols that actually do not have any mod slots available for them. And that kind of eats into their, especially their sustain, of course. Some of the weapons that were kind of used to having magazine mod slots, for instance, in the M9 and the P4Xs or the PX4s, they don't in Division 1. But then actually for me, what I feel the one I'm going to go with mostly is actually the 1911. But then specifically the tactical and the M45, as they have one mod slot more than the M1911. Of note, actually, as well, in Division 1 here, we already saw that actually in the Infantry MG5 and the MG5, basically, they're actually combined in there, and that's not an accident. They have the same amount of mods in Division 1. Some weapons don't. So for instance, yeah, the M1911 versus the tactical M45, I think is missing one mod slot. But a lot of those weapons that were kind of used being into separate categories, even if they have like one mod slot less, like the MG5s, they're not split up in that way. And because of that, yeah, they're still like, you're just worse off with one mod slot less because you just have the same base and the rest of the stats are the same and you're just losing out on mod slot basically. So yeah, that doesn't make much sense to go with those. But then in the case, yeah, for instance, the Infantry MG5 and MG5 in Division 1, they basically have the same mod slots here as well. But there are some other examples that don't jump to mind, but that have different mod slots amounts, but they don't actually get separated here into different base damages. That didn't start until Division 2. On the burst then, yeah, we have the 93R and then also two revolvers. Before we actually hit this 100% mark, as I've kind of put it below it again, the burst weapons in Division 1 kind of, yeah, over-reporting quite a bit, but unless you're really macroing them, you're not going to get that out of it, because, yeah, that is, those RPMs, you're not going to be able to click those yourself consistently, at least I feel. The X45s definitely kind of stand out here. Also, why in this case, the X45s, there is two different variants of them, and one of them has actually just 5 rounds less. So especially as well, it being a percentage-based magazine size that you're adding into there, it turns out, and the bases and such are the same. This is actually the other one that I couldn't think of, but there was basically no reason to go with the X45 over a first wave X45. They have the same bases, just their magazine, same RPMs, you know, same burst numbers, but just not the same sustain numbers because the magazine is just way smaller on the X45 versus the first wave one. But I feel overall, just because of the RPM, and actually that's becoming here the factor, is just either going with any of the revolvers, or the revolvers, especially on their sustain end, they kind of suck, and that's kind of the thing that holds them back. We have just very low magazine size and a decently chunky reload, although, yeah, all of the pistols are pretty quick in Division 1. That kind of holds them back, but then, for instance, yeah, the 1911s and such are still decent on their sustain, and yeah, 310 RPM, so what we can see this as is a little bit over 5 clicks, right? This would be a little bit over 5 rounds per second, so you need to click around a little bit over 5 times per second, and that's actually doable. That is actually doable versus trying to do 10 consistently for minutes upon minutes, maybe. I don't feel that is kind of realistic. And then on the damage per mag end, especially the types that don't have a magazine slot. So for instance, we see that in the M9 and the P4Xs, PX4s, I keep saying it wrong. Those, for instance, don't have a magazine slot, and that hurts their damage per mag quite a bit. So it's always going to be basically between the X45, if you can actually click really, really quickly. Or, for instance here, what I'm likely going to go with is the M45 and the tactical 1911s. Both can't be crafted at 256. That's also actually a factor in Division 1. One of the reasons the M4, the lightweight M4, is so popular is that you can craft it at at the max gear score, basically. The weapons that can't be will have to be farmed, and without targeted loot in Division 1, that's a lot harder. But for me here, definitely, yeah, the standouts, especially those. I feel in the case of the exotics, none of them really have good enough talents to kind of make up for their deficiencies in burst and sustain, basically, versus the high end. So in the high end, in here, even though we can actually just have exotic there, quite often we just choose not to. And coming to the end of the road with these DPS tables, the MMRs. Now, in the MMR category is a lot of weapons that you would normally consider in, well, if you're a Division 2 headed person, of being rifles. But yeah, the rifle category didn't exist. That's also why there's no rifle tab here. Things like the Mark 20 and the Mark 17 and the M1A and such, and the Scar H, which is nowadays actually combined into the Mark 17. Those actually, yeah, are all rifles in Division 2, but here that category didn't exist. They were MMRs. One interesting thing is as well is actually the Mark 17 and the Mark 20 actually share stats. And of course, the Mark 20 in Division 2 is an MMR. The Mark 17 is a rifle sharing stats with the Scar H, which is the other which is the other. They're basically combined together into the two Mark 17 variants that we have in Division 2. So yeah, it's an oddity there. But yeah, we see here that also, for instance, actually, yeah, the Classic, here's another one of these, where the Classic, the First Wave, and the SOCOM, Classic M1A, or well, M1A, actually all share base stats, but then the Classic actually has one mod slot less. So in Division 1, it would just be a waste, honestly, because also handling-wise, they seem pretty similar, if not exact same. But then the Classic just gives up a mod without, where in Division 2 we gain stats, and also, well, it has a different RPM actually, but without gaining anything in return for that. So it's actually just a worse choice. Here though, actually with the MMRs, we're kind of starting with a base damage table. That's the same thing I do in Division 2, as there, for instance, for Headhunter especially, it matters what the base is. Turns out actually in Division 1, it also kind of just matters for that because of Hunter's Fury, and especially as well the way that we use the talent that I'm also blanking on, but actually I won't have on this character, which is that if you get a crit kill, the next kill would be guaranteed crit. Basically, that means that you will kind of still lean towards using the highest base that you can get without giving up too much else. In the case in Division 1, we have that here basically, and that is that we have the Classic M44 carbine, the Hunting M44. Both of these are not in the same way as Division 2. They're actually an integral magazine, so you reload per 5 shots basically. That's the max that they have. The thing is, with Hunter's Fate especially, the reload resets the talent. If you're not familiar with Hunter's Fate, is basically you get a bonus on hitting at all, body or headshots. You get double bonus if you have the classified for headshots. This bonus basically will keep stacking up to a amp of 100% with 15% basically per segment. But if you reload, you lose it. So what that means that having, for instance, a larger magazine pool does make a big difference there, and that's also why usually the recommended weapon for it is the M700 tactical or a carbon. I mean, and we see that kind of here. While the carbon and the tactical actually share same stats, I believe actually in Division 1 it's the same as well. The tactical actually has either a mod slot less or one of its mod slot is actually worse. In Division 2, for instance, it's a side mod slot, meaning that you can't put any handling mods there. You can only put crit chance there, which is actually kind of useless. But yeah, the M700 carbon is kind of the go-to for that. We see also kind of, actually currently I'm running SRSs because, for instance, again, no target loot, so it's kind of hard to get specifically a specific MMR, and I don't actually have any good Model 700 carbons as well. We can't craft those, but I do actually have some SRSs, and I definitely see that I could stand to improve because you're jumping from this basically a 132k to a 144k. That's actually a big difference between those two. Then here actually, yeah, for the faster firing ones, it doesn't make too much sense. We don't care there too much about their base. This is mostly, for instance, to kind of compare the bolt actions, especially for Hunter's Fate. Same as well for the exotics, not so much here, but that's also why we have burst and sustain tables for those especially as well. In the burst and sustain ones, we see that actually, yeah, the M1As do pretty well, and also their RPM is very handleable. But especially one thing that I didn't know of is that the Mark 17 and the Scar H aren't the same, because I just assumed they would be. I would assume that the Scar H and the Mark 17 share stats and the Mark 20 is a separate one, but it turns out that that isn't the case. The Scar H actually does a little bit better on the burst numbers. And especially here as well, it is actually really close to those. And I feel actually the Scar H does handle a little bit better. And of course, it has a much bigger mag size. Or you could also translate this mag size into maybe even more RPM for it, because you could go actually with the magazines. We're not doing that per se here. In the Division 2 tables, I might actually add that into here in the future, where we do it, for instance, with the LMGs, we do a pouch, and also we do a rate of fire mag. Here I haven't done that, but what we could do actually is, yeah, instead of going with taking this basically to this 44 from 20, we could actually go with one that is much more has much more rate of fire, for instance. And that would, of course, increase our burst beyond what the SOCOM can, or what the SOCOM or first wave M1A can, because there you would want to have the, go from 10 to 22. But I wouldn't mind actually playing around with some of these. I don't have a SCAR H to mess around with yet, but I would love to actually see like if that holds up a little bit. Although the thing is that mostly where this gets used is kind of, in my opinion, more so towards the center. Although, well, you use it for Deadeye especially as well, or you can use it for Deadeye. But Sentry Skull, of course, is kind of the go-to for some of these. But then the MDR, especially as well, is actually a competitive burst DPS versus these. Together with that, it's actually much more handleable. And has better bonuses because actually, yeah, in the same trend as Division 2, Division 1's rifles actually, or MMRs, having a headshot bonus versus where in Division 1 the ARs have enemy armor damage, basically DTA stats. That is much more useful than or much more potent of a stat than a headshot ever will be. And also, actually, in the exotics, we see that, for instance, the Devil and Heal, which also actually don't, they can have their normal, or well, they have a shared talent basically between them that is actually pretty good when you're running both. They actually do compete decently well with the rest. They're actually ahead of the rest. These as well, they'll become basically the 6-7-16 and the 6-7-16 CQB in Division 2 basically is what those two will turn into in the future. But they aren't here yet. And yeah, well, burst-wise, they do actually kind of compete above the rest. But yeah, their talent kind of holds it back because it's still, if you're just having a consistent talent in that third slot, that could outdo them pretty consistently. And yeah, under sustain, it's kind of the same story. The M1A and the SCAR H kind of flip, and it's kind of the same here, where these two are definitely the standouts, and it then kind of falls away, especially on burst and sustain. Of course, the bolt actions we wouldn't really kind of consider in that way, but especially, for instance, the SVD, which is actually a weapon I've been taking to kind of using, we see that it's actually on burst and sustain kind of behind those, and actually I feel, well, it handles maybe a tiny bit better than some of these. I think I'm gonna lean toward maybe trying at a SCAR H in the future. That leads us to the end actually of this DPS tables. Anyway, we kind of did some analysis there as well. Let's actually now take it to MultiCalc and kind of discuss the MultiCalc itself, and then also one that I filled in earlier. And yeah, let's start discussing the other tool that is part of of this, especially having the DPS tables is kind of needed on my end to, for instance, yeah, have the weapon bases and kind of compare lightly, basically, especially within the weapons. There as well, actually, it would be better if we took it onto builds, but I might do that in the future for Division 1. Because, of course, those mods differences, there are mod differences in Division 1, and those will matter. But especially between, for instance, yeah, some of the ARs, some of the SMGs, most of the SMGs basically have all of the magazine slots. Most of the ARs have all of the magazine slots. So it's, for those, a little bit closer and doesn't matter that much. Here with this calculator, so it is actually, for those familiar with my Division 2 ones, this should seem very familiar. It's kind of layout in the same way. But there's, of course, differences in the way that Division 1 does its calculation. And the big one is actually that it has, instead of there being a base damage that then gets multiplied against by everything else, in here, actually, the base damage is plus, it is basically the whatever we enter as our base damage is then added together with a multiplication of the weapon modifier. So basically that hard stat that basically set by the devs, and our firearm stat. So that basically gets, this multiplies against each other, that weapon modifier and the firearms. That gives a number. This adds to the base, basically. That becomes, in effect, from that point, the base in Division 2 terms. And then everything else multiplies against that. So every other category is a multiplication against that there. But of course, this initial part here, basically in Division 2 terms, if we have weapon damage, that already altogether becomes a pool, although here we have weapon damage as well as a separate multiplier over there. Firearms isn't that. This is basically something else. But this part of it is definitely quite different than Division 2, where, yeah, it all adds together, although, well, that multiplies, those two multiply, and then that adds to the weapon base. Because of that as well, the effects of Firearms aren't as, although, well, big, especially if you're going, you know, between 3K and 9K or such. It isn't as much, especially for as big of a numbers as they are, but, you know, going between 3,000 and 9,000. That would give a very high diminishing returns if we're kind of looking at it in like weapon damage terms of Division 2, but it isn't that. And then what happens is in Division 1 as well, the headshot and the crit damage are actually additive to each other as well, which is actually something that I'm trying to look up other people's videos or other people's tools, basically. Nobody's really talking about that, which is kind of weird, because in Division 2 we make sure to kind of address that specifically, because headshot and crit damage being additive to each other is kind of a thing that you just need to know about, because if you don't know about that, you're going to get the wrong numbers. Then in the same way as Division 2, we have weapon damage plus specific weapon damage, so assault rifle damage, for instance. Those do add together as well in Division 1. Now, weapon damage by itself isn't a stat that you get much of. Honestly, I can only really think of Alpha Bridge that kind of has that. Maybe something else has it as well. Because in Division 1, mostly on the glove, you will have some specific weapon damage. So, for instance, having SMG damage or AR damage or something like that. But it is actually a much rarer stat than it is in Division 2. And because of that as well, actually, it is much more valuable, because we're just not diluting that pool to all hell. Damage to elites, yeah, in Division 1 and actually in Division 2 as well. Early on, we had damage to elites. This is just a stat that just applies when we're shooting elites. DTA, although actually in Division 1 parlance, this would be enemy armor damage. I'm just using DTA here just because I'm used to it. I think everybody that kind of nowadays will fill this in will know what it is. Damage to targets out of cover is the exact same as it is in Division 2. Then we have a few slots for amps. If you, for instance, in Division 1 especially, there are several talents and such that can be amps. So we want those to have separate there. And of course, for instance, yeah, striker stacks would be a separate multiplier that kind of goes into that. And yeah, in the same way as Division 2 ones, you basically can go from in the game. So for instance here, if we take it into the game, we can actually go into the character select, or in the character screen here. We can take our firearms number from here, just take it straight up. Then having our crit chance and our crit damages, our headshot. One of the things is though that actually this headshot, for instance, in this case, although actually I can go and look it up how much it actually was. It is 86.5. It is truncating it to 87 here. So you got to kind of pay attention. And that comes from actually, for instance, in this case, this weapon mod here being 5.5 headshot damage and not 6, for instance. So actually it truncates while it shows the full crit chance number there, or even to way too high of a degree. On the crit damage and the headshot, it actually doesn't. So sometimes you got to kind of watch out that if your crit doesn't line up, if your headshot doesn't line up, maybe add or remove a +5, 0.5 and see if that fixes it. Then as well, we have our damage to elites and enemy armor damage also listed here. So we can just take these stats over. Same for weapon damage. Yeah, so this is then the weapon damage here, here coming from my gloves. So we can just take all of those stats and plunk them into here. And that will, of course, give you a build version. And then what you can do is, and that's a nice thing about kind of having them in a multi-calculator is, for instance, if we go to the second one, one that I've filled in already, we can start comparing stuff. And then, for instance, taking and adding some of the stats. As, yeah, we come to one that I prepared earlier. This one, well, we have two here, actually. This first one is, for instance, actually comparing dropping firearms. So basically, the highest firearms we can go, at least, well, this is specifically the build I had there. Although actually not specifically the build I had there, because this is with the DT mods on it. Although actually we have turned off DT and DTA here, just for comparison's sake for a second, also for our checking numbers. In here, we can then just, for instance, alter numbers and see what our results will be. So in this case, that build with basically going one more firearms selection, I'm basically on kind of the red score. or maybe taking more stamina or electronics, usually stamina, of course. If we drop down, how much do we gain and lose? This is exactly what these multi-calculators are always for, and they kind of compare builds together as, yeah, kind of we're going up and down steps. Actually, the second one that we have here is actually the build as I have it, where I have one stamina roll. So yeah, if I went even higher, we would gain, for instance, here, basically, yeah, a little over 6% in our damage output. That is, of course, a decent amount, but that also then stands against, for instance, yeah, taking a stamina roll, and that's, for instance, what I have there as well as actually the while the DTA isn't active here, I have destructive actually as one of the talents, and I have, for instance, this 8.7k, and then I have 4.1k on stamina, so I can actually trigger destructive. So actually this other one couldn't even have the destructive up there. Then as well, actually, so here in the same way as Division 2, I have the checking numbers here. There's one thing of note, actually, and I'm wondering actually if somebody has the answer here for me. I haven't looked into it too much. I ran into this today, because I used this multi-calculator already for some, use it for with Predator's Mark and with Alpha Bridge and some other builds, Hunter's Fate. I didn't use it with Striker yet. Until today. And it turns out Striker is acting weird, because while its number that it shows in the stat screen will align with the damage number here, if I just input the stats as is, and in this case it would be this mystery weapon damage being at 0. This is the number that actually I can show that, 23461, 234, alright, actually, when we go into the game, I need to load the loadout. Let's go over here. So if I load this loadout, because I was actually messing around with the mods, if we go into the character and go look at weapon damage, which is here, 23461, and yeah, again, back to here, 23461. But then when I shoot, and we can scroll to the right here a little bit, this 0 stack on the body, this gives 23880. And this isn't a stack here, because I thought maybe it's counting the stack as you're hitting it or something like that, because we're on 0 stacks here. There seems to be just some weird 2 weapon damage in there somewhere, somehow. Because yeah, when we input an extra 2 weapon damage, which is this mystery one, taking this to 14 instead, now we align kind of perfectly. I have no idea what's going on here. And yeah, I'm curious actually if others do. Because yeah, this way it does actually align. That's also why we have the DTE and DTA on 0, because I was using it here in the range. The range in Division 1, we only have red enemies, basically. We don't have the ability to have DTE or DTA active. But yeah, these are set in this one at least, that we can set them to 100% again. Let's actually do that for comparison's sake, because also the difference in percentage stayed the same between some of these, as I tried it actually with a different striker that I have that's around this 6.3k level, basically a 6k striker. And that actually did line up with these other numbers, at least if I altered these numbers to be that build, because of course they differ tiny bits. As well, we have actually Pulse in here, because yeah, Pulse is kind of the go-to in Division 1. I'm running a Pulse there with Pulse crit chance mods, or the skill mods being towards that, so we're getting a decent amount out of it. Those are also going into here, but also, of course, they're going into all of them. Also, actually, these other 2 that we'll discuss in a second, and Predator's Mark and Alpha Bridge. In doing that, yeah, it's kind of the same for all of them, so it stays the same. But then what we can actually see is as we go from basically all red, or all firearm rolls, going to 1 firearm roll, and then in this case 1 stamina, we lose basically 6%, and that kind of holds true as we go through the range. It's kind of around that 6% mark all the way through per step, basically. So every time that we actually take 1 more stamina roll, so for instance, this 2775, this would be if you're, although, well, depends, if you're going around the 9k stamina, if you're going maybe all stamina, you're gonna have basically 40% less damage. This was always a question that I kind of had about Division 1, is like, how much do the red cores matter? And kind of in Division 2, I know, but in Division 1, I wasn't too sure. And here we kind of have an answer to it. Also, yeah, here we have a Predator's Mark and Alpha Bridge in comparison here towards a Striker. Of course, yeah, here with the Striker, we're actually kind of weirdness with that. Let's actually take that weirdness out. Let's say it was acting properly by not having any of that mystery weapon damage there. Here at 0 stacks, and this is actually the inters, because of course for the Predator's Mark we need 9k stamina, so this one's actually comparing against this 275, I think. Yeah, so these two are comparing against each other. Oh no, it's actually against this 3.9, because yeah, that Predator Mark I have actually at 4.1. So it's comparing against this 4.9. So basically the Striker with 3.9k firearms. The Alpha Bridge, it needing to kind of balance numbers. This one is comparing then against actually, I can go into the cell and see. This one's comparing against F6, so the 5.167 firearm. So this one, and in there, this one is of course ahead, because this is the inters versus basically the strikers at the same firearms, basically, right? Because this is all comparing. These ones are all comparing to the top slot, which would be a full on there. But yeah, once we kind of set some Striker stacks in there loose, yeah, this is the reason why Striker is that high. Of course, the Predator's Mark would have bleeds going around, doing basically doubling its damage on an enemy. Although it can actually spread to multiple enemies, so that might be a factor. The Alpha Bridge, of course, is triggering links continuously. But yeah, at 100 stacks, definitely none of them can compete even closely. Even if we take this to, like, let's say 30 stacks, which is much more attainable for the Striker, of course, even then, they're like way behind on their personal damage. Now, of course, in the Striker sense, this is all personal damage. Like, this is all of the damage that it does. The Predator Mark and Alpha Bridge will do some damage on top of this, but definitely not enough to kind of make up for the deficiencies there. Which is kind of the question that I already knew, kind of just by play. That yeah, Striker, way stronger than any of those. And much more consistent in his output, especially if you're kind of stacking with an ACS or, well, the showstopper in Division 1. But yeah, seeing it in these hard numbers, it is kind of hard to discount those differences. Although, of course, yeah, at 0 stacks, they can compete just because they have decent enough stats and such. You know, the sort of gear set bonuses are good enough that they can kind of keep up a little bit. Let's take it actually to this second one. On this one, I've always had this question actually, which is those purple DT mods, is it actually? Because also I've played with builds with both ways, and the difference isn't super pronounced, definitely. And we kind of see that here as well. So actually, to show it in game, what we kind of mean with this, most of the times, if we have anything, for instance, like here, which is the Striker build that we're kind of on, usually you go with these, well, for instance, in this case, Firearms mods, although, well, the type that they are doesn't per se matter, but the 4% damage to elites. Which can only be on purple. What that also means is that, for instance, here we see that this mod is a 202. So while a normal Firearms mod is generally around the 260s or more, even 267 is kind of, I think, the highest, or maybe 268 even. So you can gain a little bit of Firearms there. And then, of course, as well, those can come, as I have them, for instance, here with crit chance. So, for instance, here we have a few ones, but then here the 267. Actually, the in-game numbers as well. I could actually add in more, because here we have a few 260s and a 261, I think. Actually, no, the lowest is a 261. That's actually the numbers I went with, also to have the checking numbers there. So we could even have like a few points more there, but that wouldn't make that big of a difference here. So here we have them both with DT on. So basically we're shooting an elite. How much damage do we do against them? And when we're not shooting an elite, because when we don't have, you know, when we're not shooting an elite, those DT mods aren't doing anything, of course. And then comparing them to each other. So on the DT on, the DT mods there, while we do gain that little bit of Firearms and that crit chance, that doesn't make up for those DTE. And taking this from 28 basically to 48, and then, yeah, losing a little bit of crit chance and a little bit of firearms for that. When we are shooting elites, we're doing 9% more, basically. Just a little bit under 9% more. And yeah, that's a big jump, of course. And those are also the most dangerous enemies, right? Those are the bosses, those are the heavies and such, things that take more time to die, because the purples and the reds, they'll, even if you kill them a little bit slower, which we're kind of doing here when the DT is off, that difference isn't as pronounced. So here, when the DTE is off, as we come to this last one, and here there's a question that I've always had, which is that if we take those purple DTE mods, what's the difference in output between having those mods, which here is the purple ones, versus having high-end mods basically with crit chance, and then having 60 or so more as well towards firearms, as those mods usually have higher mods basically. So generally in Division 1, yeah, we go with these damage to elite mods. In this case, I'm going with these 202s. That's the highest ones I have. These, of course, come from vendors. Basically, you have to just wait till they come around. And that's also the thing, like, would it be a good way to go around that by just going with those high-end mods? And how much does that actually matter? So here, yeah, we're taking some 202s with 4 DTE, against some mods here that are basically just around the pretty high up, but not all maxed out, because I wanted to have the same, checking numbers. So the lowest one we have in here going in here is 261s, basically with +1 crit chance. If we then look at here, what we of course gain is that little bit of DTE, but yeah, basically taking this 28 to a 48. On the other end, we would basically gain a little bit of crit chance and some firearms, but just, yeah, small amounts there and a decent amount difference there. If we compare here first the DT ons versus each other, we see that when we're shooting actually at elites, going with those DT mods is around a 9% gain. And that's, of course, a decent amount. That is actually, and that's also against, the enemies that already take the most to kill. These will be the names, these will be, the heavies and such. They'll always be elite. So yeah, that's kind of where that matters. And then if the DTE is off, so we're basically shooting at a purple or a red or such, then the other version, so going with the yellow mods, actually is 5% ahead. Now, would I say that actually in some content this might be better? I might actually say that, because, for instance, some of the incursions and such, having done a few of them now, kind of caught up finally on them, there's a lot of purples in there. If it is basically a balance between these two, because while being 9% ahead there, but then you're 5% behind whenever you're shooting at the purples and such. It depends on if there's way too many purples, but as a general one, I would definitely go with the DT ones if you have that option, if you have those mods. Because the more dangerous enemies are always going to be the elites, especially in Division 1 as well. If you're doing, for instance, challenging missions, about 90% of the enemies will be elites. It's not like in Division 2 where actually they intermix them quite a bit. In general, in Division 1, if you are playing a mission on normal, it's mostly reds with maybe a purple or so in there. If you're doing it on hard, it's mostly purples and then maybe an elite or such for a heavy and the boss and such. And then if you're playing it on challenging or above, it's generally mostly elites with maybe a purple or a red here or there. So in general, yeah, especially if you're just Lexingtoning, Division 1's Lincoln. If you're Lexingtoning the whole time, yeah, that definitely go to. But also, yeah, it's the difference is there, but it's also not as pronounced as in either way, basically. In general, I would still go that route, except especially, yeah, for instance, some of the incursions, Falcon Lost, for instance, there's a lot of elites there, or a lot of purples there. I might actually lean into sticking some of these mods in there for those kind of things. Although, in the end, I'm just going to be lazy and just always run that, right? But this was one of those things that I kind of had a question about, and we kind of have it answered here. This inter here as well is actually between between basically these two versus their brethren up there. So the min max as well when the DT is off. So because of the DT being higher, it's basically a narrower band. The other one, when it loses DT, it's a much bigger band, of course, right? Kind of in the same way that you would kind of see the lower and upper bands in the way of sustain and burst. But yeah, not by enough that I would lean towards going those crit chance mods with the high-end crit chance mods. Definitely those DTs are worth it. One thing though that I would definitely say is if you're going with 3%, it's not worth it, because yeah, that turns out to be enough of a, you basically lose this difference here. And trying to get 260 plus 1 crit chance, plus 1% crit chance mods, that's actually pretty easy because you can craft for them and such. So if you have a set of those versus 3%, to go with high end. If you have a 4% set, yeah, it's definitely worth going that route. And yeah, that's also kind of what we already knew, as that's kind of the gold standard for Division 1. And with that, we come to the end of looking at some Division 1 things and stuff. As I've been meaning to make these for forever. I've been always talking about making a DPS table and also a multi-calculator for Division 1. Especially in making a multi-calculator as well, I feel once you kind of, or making any calculator there. That's a good way of making sure you kind of understand the basics of it. Definitely for me as well, going through in making this and kind of checking it against in-game and such. I've learned quite a bit about like how actually the system in Division 1 works, because for instance, yeah, the headshot and crit damage being additive to each other, I wasn't sure of that at all. I didn't understand actually yet that that kind of normalized the weapon modifier and such. Even as well, actually, that weapon damage plus specific weapon damage is already actually additive in Division 1, although it basically only comes up with Alpha Bridge, so it's not a common thing. But especially having the weapon DPS tables, yeah, those are a core tool that I basically need to have for myself anyway, so... but yeah, all will be linked down below, so if you are interested in them, feel free to go and check them out, as yeah, they live in the folders as well that normally the Division 2 files would live in as well, with the DPS tables being over there. Now, of course, these won't change much because, yeah, Division 1 is not per se getting updates, but also if you spot any faults or flaws in it, feel free to actually contact me and we'll get those sorted out, as definitely I've gone through and kind of checked a bunch of the weapons. I made sure that, yeah, most of the weapons that, for instance, don't have a magazine slot, so for instance, as well, the PP19s or not the some of the pistols, but then, for instance, originally I had the PP19 as not having a magazine slot, but actually in Division 1, it does have a magazine slot. There might be some errors like that. So yeah, feel free to bring those forward if you catch them. But yeah, we come then to the end of this video. I hope you found this informative and enjoyed going maybe a little bit of nostalgia here with some Division 1ing. As yeah, I'll actually be playing quite a bit of Division 1 on stream the coming week. As starting Monday, there'll be a global event starting the 19th of May, upcoming for a week. So yeah, actually, I'll be jumping quite a bit into there, as I've been quite enjoying going and trying to catch up and trying to, as well, get all of the commendations for all of the global events, as yeah, some of those back in the day, I just didn't partake too much in Division 1, especially not so much in the global events and such, not to the degree that I do nowadays. So yeah, kind of going back and getting those filled in. And I've been very much enjoying my time with Division 1. It's just enough different that that it is a different game, and then just enough the same that it's definitely Division. So yeah, if you did enjoy this video, please do any and all of the algorithm things down below, as that does help out. So I'll do that little bit of shilling here. In the future, we'll definitely go and actually finally do that refactor build showcase. That's likely the next thing on this docket. So that'll likely be next. So yeah, I hope you join me for those. And as always, have a good night.